Our top story this hour. American lawmakers are free to criticize Israel's looming annexation plans, so says the leading pro-Israel lobby in the U.S., the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, or AIPAC. Sources say the message was delivered in Zoom meetings. It's an unusual one, especially because the group usually discourages public criticism of Israel. The development follows the date set by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, July 1st, as a deadline to annex parts of the West Bank, despite criticism that the move would set back any efforts to bring peace to the region. Earlier, I was joined by our international affairs correspondent, Bianca Zanini, with more on this story.
It's a shift from what we usually see from AIPAC, and that's why this is interesting. You mentioned it shortly yourself. AIPAC does not support and actually actively discourages any official public criticism of Israel. They've been keeping very much in line with the government of Benjamin Netanyahu. They've been supporting it very much. It's different from, for instance, J Street, which is often seen as their rival, which holds the line that you can criticize the government but still support Israel. AIPAC tends to have much more of a united front on this, and officially it has stayed silent on this issue. What we're hearing is that in private, behind closed doors, they're sending that message that perhaps they're not encouraging it, but they are allowing lawmakers to give their opinion on this issue. Annexation is complicated, and there is not one united voice when it comes to this, not even here in Israel, not even within the government itself.
The news is also sending shockwaves throughout Israel's neighbors. Jordanian Foreign Minister Ayman Safadi has also called to prevent Israel's plans to annex parts of the West Bank during a press conference with his German counterpart Heiko Maas in Jordan. Take a listen.
I think what we're working on, along with our German partners and our partners in the region and beyond, is to make sure that everybody understands how dangerous annexation is going to be, how imperative it is to stop annexation, because ultimately it is a path to institutionalized apartheid in Palestine, and that's not a recipe for peace.
Let's bring in our Middle East correspondent, Adi Koplowitz, joining me via Skype. Adi, thank you for being with us. Adi, this should come as no surprise, as Jordan has previously stated it is not happy with these plans of annexation. Obviously, the Jordan Valley is part of that plan, and Ayman Safadi really just drawing that line once again.
Definitely, Ayman. Jordan seems to be the Arab country leading the struggle against a possible Israeli annexation of parts of the West Bank, and specifically the Jordan Valley, which is a rather big portion of the West Bank. However, it's quite surprising that Jordan is pretty much the only Arab country that has been putting forward this struggle so much. We've hardly heard any rejections of the annexation plan from other Arab countries lately. We did hear certain statements coming from Saudi Arabia and from the Arab League, but altogether, it's surprising how silent the Arab world is regarding this issue. However, when we look into the Palestinian struggle against the possibility of an Israeli annexation, we're getting quite the confusing image of what's the Palestinian strategy. On one hand, we're hearing Palestinians saying that different European nations promise them that if Israel follows through with annexation, then their countries in Europe will acknowledge Palestine as an independent state. And we've heard Palestinian Prime Minister Mohammed Shtaya saying that if Israel follows through, then the Palestinians will definitely consider maybe declaring Palestine as a sovereign state. On the other hand, we are hearing Palestinian officials saying that if Israel follows through with annexing parts of the West Bank, they will give more and more of the responsibilities of what's going on in the West Bank to Israel, and they will let Israel run also the civil affairs in the West Bank. So this means giving less and less authority to the Palestinian government. So it's really quite unclear for now what path is the Palestinian Authority and the Palestinian government going to take in order to prevent this annexation from happening. What we do know is that Jordan is leading the diplomatic struggle, and the Palestinians are trying to focus on steps on the ground in the West Bank in order to pressure Israel and prevent Israel from following through with this plan of potential annexation on July 1st to July 7th.
All right, our Adi Koplowitz with more insight into the story. Adi, thank you for being with us this hour. Now to the public opinion here in Israel over this issue. A poll conducted this week shows 67% of the Jewish public objects to a Palestinian state, including a majority of voters for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's party, the Likud. 68% of respondents also approved of Israeli plans to annex parts of the West Bank. So how does this play out for the premier? Our diplomatic correspondent, Eli Hohenberg, joined me earlier with the latest.
Well, Ayman, this is a particularly interesting poll because it shows how successful, to an extent, is the campaign conducted by some elements of the right wing, some elements within the settler movement, to make a distinction between applying sovereignty and the formation of a Palestinian state, or more relevant to our case, that to make sure Netanyahu will not do both moves at the same time. The main claim of those settler elements that oppose the plan to apply sovereignty over parts of the West Bank and the Jordan Valley is that this is essentially the kickstart of a process that at the end a Palestinian state will be formed. They want to see Israel applying sovereignty over those territories, but without leaving any room for a Palestinian state to be established later on. And what we've seen in the past weeks is, again, rising pressure on behalf of those groups on Netanyahu, and by that affecting or influencing public opinion and making sure that everyone knows it's not the only solution. It's not the only route of action to apply sovereignty and see a Palestinian state being formed. And this is why, again, they're making a distinction. And this poll shows very clearly majority of the Jewish public, and this is important to note, the Jewish public wants to see annexation, but without a Palestinian state. So we're seeing this pressure rising steadily in the past weeks. Very harsh meeting between Netanyahu and some settler leaders 2 weeks ago. All of this, again, in a bid to prevent this pending annexation that is seeing many hurdles underway, as we've heard earlier in the broadcast.
Well, Israeli President Reuven Rivlin held a video conference with Jewish community leaders from the United States on Wednesday, where he called for the community to stand together in the face of anti-Semitism and stressed that the bond between the American Jewish community and Israel must be strengthened now more than ever. He told his audience, quote, "We must stand together fighting all forms of anti-Semitism and all forms of racism. Anti-Semitism and racism are two sides of the same coin, and we must fight them wherever they appear." Still in Israel, dozens of protesters took to the streets of Jaffa Wednesday, clashing with police in a third night of demonstrations against a plan to build a homeless shelter on land discovered to have been an ancient Muslim cemetery. Police said the protesters set trash cans on fire and threw stones at officers who arrested 4 people. The demonstrations were smaller than the previous day when protesters clashed with police. A video released by police showed Tel Aviv city buses with shattered windows stopped by the side of the road, and riot police using stun grenades to disperse the rioters by Jaffa's clock tower.